Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next session. It's great to have you back if you've joined us before, or welcome if this is the first session you're tuning in today. Before we kick off the next session, just a few reminders. If you haven't already, go and check out Product Led Alliance. You'll find lots of useful resources there. You can join our free Slack community that's got 7,500 other product-led pros in there. So be sure to check that out. We do have some paid membership options as well there if you're looking for a really deep dive. So we're going to go straight into our next panel discussion. This one is really interesting topic. It's around defining and delivering your product strategy successfully. I'm sure that is a topic that you are all very keen on. And so I'm really looking forward to this one. We will have time for questions from the audience at the end of the session. So do just submit those. As you think of them, drop them in that chat. You don't need to wait until the end. If you submit them throughout the session, we'll come back to them at the very end of the session. We've got about 15 minutes or so set aside to ask your questions. So I do encourage you to take advantage of that. Now, without any further ado, I'm going to invite all of our panelists to join us on the stage, switch on their cameras and their microphones. And I will ask them to, I could read out a list of names, but I always think it's more interesting to have people introduce themselves. So I will ask you to just one by one briefly introduce yourself. Chris, maybe we could start with you.
Sure, happy to. Hi, I'm Chris Butler. I'm lead PM at Google, working on the core machine learning team. And so my background is a lot of product management experience over the last, I guess, 2 or so decades. I've worked at places like Microsoft, Waze, Kayak, Facebook Reality Labs, Cognizant. I've also worked a lot in product operations. So I've done the PLA course on product operations here as well. And so I have a lot of opinions about a lot of things, and I'm happy to be here. And especially strategy, that's something I've been talking about and work on actively right now inside my team. So thank you for having me.
Chris. And thanks for the plug for PLA courses as well there. Make sure you check those out. Kerry, if we could come to you next, if you could tell us a little about yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, James. Hey, everyone. I'm Carrie Tian. I'm currently a product manager at Wave, which does financial infrastructure for Sub-Saharan Africa. Before that, I was at MailChimp as product lead for their email product. And I've previously worked at other startups, including Medium. And I'm based in New York City.
Great, thank you very much. Yogesh, I can see that you've got your microphone off, so we'll come to you next.
Hey everyone, my name is Yogesh Ratnaparkhi. I'm a principal PM at Microsoft. I lead the OneDrive and SharePoint's migration strategy, help thousands of customers move petabytes of data. I have a platform product experience for majority of my career where I deal with customers, end users, and partners. Before Microsoft, I worked at Expedia, where I led the marketing asset strategy. And even before that, I worked for a startup which then went IPO in Australia called Limeade, which helps companies improve the well-being of their employees. So I'm really excited to be here. And I'm in Seattle. Excited about the session.
Great, thank you. And last but not least by any means, I'm sure, Kushal, do you want to give us an intro?
Yeah, definitely. This is Kaushal Shah. I'm a product leader at Ernst & Young. I'm currently based in Cleveland, and I'll be moving to Austin in about 2.5 weeks. So I'm in midst of all of that. I've been with EY for about 10 years now, and building innovative products creatively and managing the execution is my jam. I've been fortunate to be part of products in different spaces like ad tech, fintech, payment systems, corporate responsibility, etc. Within the firm, outside the firm, in my previous companies. And I'm glad to be here today with these fine people. Thanks, James.
Great, thank you. And thank you all very much for being here. We really appreciate it. Lots of very great experience for you all to draw on. So we're really looking forward to this session. If you would like to ask your questions to the panel, do remember to submit those and they'll be able to offer answers towards the end. So we're going to jump straight in with the first question. So the first thing that I thought would be an interesting point to talk about really was product strategy is only going to be successful if it aligns well with the wider business strategy and supports the wider organizations of the goal. So how can we, as product people, make sure that that is the case, that your product strategy aligns with that wider business strategy? I don't know who wants to jump in first on that one.
I mean, maybe I'd like to just say that I don't think there should be a big difference between your business strategy and your product strategy. And the reason why I say that is that, product management, as much as I know we keep using this Venn diagram that's trying to describe what we do, I think does really imperfectly. It's not that we're necessarily at the center of all these things, but it's that we're constantly talking about the trade-offs, which I would argue is really a core of like any strategy, is what are the things that we want to do or we think we need to do to be able to get to some type of end vision or mission or goal that we're trying to get to. And then what are the trade-offs that we need to make, or what are we saying no to be able to get there? And so I think when we start to separate out the business strategy from the product strategy, I think you don't necessarily embrace the ways that you would end up like enabling your business strategy through the product. And so I think I've found generally when there's a big distinction between the business and the product strategy, it ends up being in more legacy companies that tend to have like an IT organization rather than like an actual integrated organization. And so that's just one thing I would say. I mean, I definitely think that you should include the trade-offs of your business model inside of your product, because your product can do a lot of great things to enable that business model. And so that's maybe the first thing I would say.
And to add to that, with the product-led growth mindset, it helps you to not differentiate the two visions that you have. Because like Chris rightly pointed out, because if you have those two as a separate thing, then now you're balancing between two different things. Then the company agenda could be completely different than your product agenda. But if your product is your main selling point, or a product suite for that matter, so that vision has to be like the main thing that drives the company. So a product-led growth, that's the mindset that's ideal for, especially for startup companies and even when you mature.
Yeah, I largely agree with that. And then if we get a little bit more tactical about how do you make sure that what you as a team or as a product group are working on, that ladders up nicely to the overall company strategy or product strategy. Two things that I wanted to mention that I found really helpful. One is getting as granular about numbers as possible. So talking about, hey, here are our potential ideas for what to ship or what levers we can pull on. And then here's how I see this impacting the business. I've seen this vary at different companies. I describe MailChimp as extremely metrics driven and quite dialed in about what differences in CAC or LTV, what ripple effects that might have across all of our business units. Whereas here at Wave, because it's a fintech company, all of our metrics tend to be more exponential, because once you have users paying each other, suddenly behavior can really ramp up in nonlinear ways. Anyway, even though Wave is relatively less metrics driven, it's still quite useful whenever I'm talking to company leadership to still make sure that we all have the same mental model of what metrics I feel most capable of driving, and then checking whether we all have similar intuitions about the impact that'll have on the rest of the company. The other thing I wanted to quickly mention is that it's really helpful to figure out where teams inevitably contradict each other. And I think this happens whenever your company is beyond maybe a few product groups. So a couple classic examples I've seen might be product teams that are responsible for attracting new users versus product teams that want to drive conversions and upgrades. Those can be a bit at odds, where if we remove some feature functionality to paid plans to attract more conversions, that might be a worse new user experience. And then another example of potential collisions are like core product teams against risk or compliance teams. And I think all of that is inevitable tensions to manage in kind of a complex strategy world. And I think instead of shying away from those, one really helpful thing is to lean in and discuss those with company leadership and with fellow product leaders to see, okay, we say we really want growth, but at what point does our risk aversion or does our need to be compliant overrule our quest for growth? And figuring out that really helps hammer home like practically how to execute a strategy that can sometimes be more lofty or more conceptual.
Yeah, I would add to what Carrie said and operationalize everything that Chris and Kaushal said. Usually, businesses have 4 pillars, or 4 metrics how they measure their business, right? One is the revenue, the other is the engagement, adoption, usage, whatever you want to call it. The third one is like how you measure the user or customer satisfaction. And the fourth is the cost, right? Most businesses have at least these 4 metrics. And often your product optimizes one or more of these, right? So starting with the question of what is it that your product primarily helps. In my case, as I said, I'm in the acquisition part of OneDrive and SharePoint. So I primarily map or ladder up to the revenue or the growth aspect of the strategy. So I usually start with there, right, and make sure that I'm aligned. So let's say we want to acquire X many million new users or X thousand new enterprise customers. Then how does my product strategy help with that, right? And that's where the alignment can begin from day one. And OKR is a really effective and powerful framework which kind of make sure that you can ensure that alignment. In our org, we start our planning session with OKRs first, and then we start kind of building strategy around it. And that's really helpful. And then you break it down into granular OKRs. So let's say I want to grow, right? That's where I map to how do I enable growth? And for me, it's like enabling our customers, enabling our partners, and then enabling the end users, right? And then for each of the pillar, in some ways that is the strategy. I'm going to help customers, users, and partners. And then for each of the strategic pillar, then I will have a strategy to enable each of the entities, right? So for customers, the best way, the most effective strategy is to remove all the hurdles, right? And then you can go down. What's required to remove those hurdles is to make sure it's easily discoverable once they start. They can go through. So really kind of managing the funnel and keeping an eye on where you have a drop off. So kind of to wrap it all up, starting with the organizational goals and then choosing one or two. I would not encourage trying to optimize all 4, starting maybe 2, and then making sure you're not abusing the others. Like you definitely don't want to kind of ignore cost when you're trying to grow. So I think that's how I would kind of recommend to make sure that you have the alignment throughout your strategy.
Absolutely, great. And it was interesting, Kerry, that you mentioned about kind of execution. And I suppose a strategy is only ever as good as its execution. So I just wanted to maybe we could move to think about a little bit how you can make sure that your day-to-day activities align with that strategy and lead to the realization of it. How can we ensure that we're executing on what we're trying to achieve? Carrie, I'm going to throw you in at the deep end, as it was you that made me jump onto that thought.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would say, okay, to get super tactical, since this is the execution question, something I pay attention to is whether I and every member of my team can always articulate why they're working on what they're working on, and how that should ladder up to the end goals that we're trying to drive, or to a specific strategic project we have. And this sounds incredibly basic, but it can be surprising how in the course of work, just random stuff keeps popping up, and it's like, oh, X other team needs something, or I think the biggest culprit tends to be like a small task or favor ends up ballooning out into something huge. At Wave, we call these projects hot potatoes, and we routinely check in like, hey, does anyone feel like you're working on something where you've kind of lost the thread and are, on step 3 of 27, and you just want to check in and make sure we still want to do this? I guess another tactical thing to quickly mention is we start meetings with, hey, does everyone feel like they're working on the most important thing that's available to them? Or have we seen opportunities that we really should jump on now instead of what the current slate of projects? And then maybe the very last thing I want to mention is for the last question, I'd said to figure out points of divergence between product teams, or times when individual teams' strategies might collide. And I find those always really interesting because that gets at the heart of the contradictions and messiness and compromise that I think Chris mentioned. Like, product is all about managing those trade-offs and coming up with something coherent despite a million constraints. And I think pausing whenever you see like, hey, X other team is doing something that seems diametrically opposed to what we're trying to do, and instead of like hoping it'll go away, or like we'll keep doing our thing and they'll do theirs and hopefully it'll work out, I have found it really valuable to pause and talk about it. And every time I come away with a better articulation of what the company actually values and like where it's willing to make trade-offs in growth against stability, or growth against profitability, or any other like useful compromise.
Chris, it looked like you're in violent agreement there with what Carrie was saying.
No, I think like really focusing on the controversies within your organization are really the most powerful things you can do to, I think, link the real strategy down to the day-to-day. And I've been starting to call it kind of the product spine. I think other people have called it like flight levels. I've seen a couple other versions of this, but essentially like, how do you from whatever you call strategy, right? Which from my perspective is a series of kind of guidance around trade-offs or this over that statements or something like that, to your roadmap, to your day-to-day task list. I think that type of linkage is really important. And if you don't know where the controversies are inside of that system, you'll end up building things that are middling or not really valuable, because everybody's kind of, the strategy itself is so kind of open-ended and vague, right? Like Richard Rummel has talked about this in Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, about like fluff, right? Or things that are just like superlatives, like best in class. Like, I've been trying to banish best in class from every strategic document within our organization because it doesn't mean anything. And so those controversies and those trade-offs are really important. And I think if you do not actually identify those at the different levels of strategy, roadmap, and tasks, you can end up getting a lot of drift between those things, which I think then creates a lot of problems for the organization. One person I follow a lot, Von Tan, who wrote The Uncertainty Mindset, he posted an article about something he calls a Boris technique, which is essentially a way for strategic discussions to happen at the leadership level about what are the different trade-offs and how do we find or identify the trade-offs that we all are making as individuals within a team, and then how do we align them in some way. And I think this is really, really valuable when we start to decide what is the top level guidance, like top down type of trade-off discussions that are, again, usually providing through strategy or OKRs or something like that. And then the bottoms up emergent behavior, which is when people are learning from their customers, how do they know what are the right kind of hard decisions to make based on that guidance from the top down, but then can still build things that are valuable to those people. And so I think that's the combination that's really important, I think, especially in like what I would call uneven landscapes, right? Like landscapes where there's a lot of complexity or change that's happening. And I would argue that most of the things that product managers are brought in to work on are usually things that are in complex landscapes. If it's something that is already well known and done over and over and over again, you're probably a professional service organization and you really just need like a business analyst or a project manager or something like that, right? So I think when we talk about execution, it's really about how are we constantly linking. I think Carrie mentioned that too, is like how at the beginning of every meeting are we like incepting people with what the proto strategy is essentially, like what is the key trade-off we're making here, or what are we trying to do? And so being that broken record, I think aids in how we actually do execution at the team level as well.
Absolutely, I can definitely sympathise with the complexity piece there, and not just to be able to do the same over and over again. Kushal, did you have anything to add on that point about getting tactical and how to kind of really deliver that day to day?
Yeah, absolutely. So many times you observe, like it's important to avoid to be in a situation where you find that there are certain other feature teams who are working on something completely, which is like completely different than what we had envisioned going into a particular release. So that's the reason we have like a decision making process wherein like if there are any new injects, like first it goes through a decision making process. Like it should not be a surprise that why certain thing is being built without consensus from all the different teams. And it may or may not happen all the time, but it's important that that sort of discipline is followed. And and the injects can be of different types. There could be certain technical data items, very architectural oriented things that you might not have envisioned in the beginning of the release. But how do you handle that? So that's essentially your day to day. And when we are talking about the trade-offs, so that's what you bring to the table. First, from product management standpoint, it's important to understand the technical aspects here. That why you need to lay a solid foundation and then build the features on it. Can a particular feature be shelved for a period of time so that you build that solid foundation and eventually get to that? So those trade-off questions I personally encounter very often, and many times like to your stakeholders, to your clients, it's a tough pill for them to swallow. So it's a product manager's responsibility to explain to them that you're not facing the issue maybe now, but eventually you will. And this is the reason you have to fill that gap and essentially make a smoother roadway for yourself.
Right. And Yogesh, anything that you wanted to add on that point?
No, all excellent points from everyone here. The only thing I would add is, I read somewhere that, a product manager's job is to tell everyone, make it very clear what game we are playing and how we're gonna win this, right? Like, how do we know we are winning? And what that translates to me is, and going back to that strategy part and baking that into day to day, is come up with a way, whether it's a dashboard, whether it's a chart that you look at every day, where you can map your day-to-day activities with your end goal, right? It could be that you're trying to improve the funnel, right? And you're working on a feature release and going back after the release and seeing what impact did that feature release make. And that kind of attribution of what the work you did to what you plan to achieve, I think is really important. Often we set a really good strategy, we prioritize really well based on the goals, but it's very tempting to move on and not look back and see if did we make that impact, right? So it could be part of your sprint retro, or it could be a monthly show and tell where you really look back and see if you were able to make that impact. And kind of a few steps back, when you're making these decisions on a daily basis, or you're in your team meeting, reminding why we are doing this. Remember, one of our key results is that everything needs to be actionable, for example, right? That customers should just be able to take an action and not be confused. And based on that, I think this feature is important. And I think unless we do this, we will not meet our goal. So just really bringing those outcomes in our day-to-day discussion is a really great way to infuse that culture, into your team.
Can I add something about metrics as well? I know a lot of people are mentioning metrics here, and I think I've started to change I guess, the way that I create a relationship between the strategy and the metrics. And so, I think there's really great techniques like John Cutler's talking a lot about North Star metrics, and it actually means something very different inside of large organizations. For some reason, North Star means like vision inside of Google and other places I've been. But I think this idea of like, what are the signals that tell you that the trade-offs you're making are the right ones? And what that means is that signals are actually this constant, like, and it could be through like key results inside of an OKR, which is supposed to show you progress, right? But these are actually just like, these are things that we think will help us understand our strategy better. And so a lot of the time when we start to now include them, when we're doing things like prioritization or judging success of a particular feature, it ends up being, can we forecast what we think this feature will do as far as these different metrics that are across different, like in our case, we have a bunch of different tenants that are trade-offs we have, and we're trying to now link those to what would be a leading and following indicator that we're doing a good thing here, right? Or we're doing something that is effective. We can only then in the future, when we look backwards, we can start to say, did these metrics actually show that we were doing something that was great? So that's like, again, using the OKR model, were we showing progress towards the objective? And then in the end, like, did the objective actually get achieved? And so I've been starting to think more about this idea of like, okay, well, these signals or these metrics that we're going to take on, they're all about how do we use them in the sense of like, I don't use the word estimation anymore, but like forecast for how this feature will contribute to this particular signal. And then when we're in the future, we end up looking backwards and we say, did these signals actually show us that we were making the right trade-offs and that these trade-offs were effective? And so anyways, I just want to like add that note. This is something that's still evolving for me, but it's been like a different way for me to think about this beyond just the idea of like, did this thing have an impact? Because I've worked at a lot of organizations that focus a lot on just like impact metrics. And so I think this is where, if we're talking about from the standpoint, like product management and the way that product management performance cycles or evaluation actually come into how strategy is impacted, is that in the case of like 6-month long performance cycles means that you will not work on things that don't show an impact in less than 6 months. And so I think that's a really bad thing for a lot of organizations when we want to do something that could potentially take more than 6 months to actually figure out and come to fruition in some way. So anyways, I've been trying to rethink about the way we use metrics in this like linking of strategy to execution and kind of deciding whether our strategy is effective or not.
Great. And one of the things that I wanted to raise as well was kind of coming back to that complexity point, right? It's going to be different all the time. And we live in a very complex world with lots of changes around us, whether that's in the market, whether it's our competitors are changing, whether it's our users are changing and want different things. How can you make sure that you have a strategy that remains flexible enough to adapt to those changes, but it doesn't become too reactive that you're no longer being strategic? How would you go about that? I think Yogesh, if we come to you first on that one.
Yeah. So it depends based on what product you are owning and what company you are in, right? So consumer products with a lot of experimentation, they have to be super agile. They could be changing their strategy I wouldn't say strategy, that they could be changing their prioritization on a weekly basis, right? For enterprise products, usually that's not the case. So the product that I own, we do a semester planning, and then we do a quarterly planning, and we try to not change the strategy. We try to stick to the outcomes, but we keep the actual features flexible. So I'll give an example. I was talking about, we want a specific aspect of the product to be really actionable because we know that this will impact the funnel, right? So it's tied directly to the strategy. That stays through the semester, because we know until we achieve this, it's not going to move the needle on the higher goals we're trying to achieve. What could change is based on our learning, based on what we are seeing from customers, based on what we are seeing from market, is how to change that, right? So initially we thought that maybe we offered a feature A, it will achieve that. But based on our learning, we realized that that's not really the case. There's something else, maybe something even more simpler could make an impact based on this learning. So keeping flexibility on features, but not so much on the outcomes, I think is a great way. Because when you set your quarterly plan that way, where you say, hey, we are committing to outcomes, but we are not committing to features, it's that much easier to pivot from what we were trying to build. It's easier to have a conversation with the engineering team to change. It's easier to change. It's easier to speak with the designer, to come up with a different design for what we were out to do. And similarly, you don't feel accountable for reporting out to the stakeholders, because we never committed on feature. We committed on what we were trying to achieve for this semester. So that, to me, I think is a really effective strategy to keep yourself agile. And going back to that, retro, doing a frequent retro is a great way to stay agile. I know it's more art than science, but I think there's no silver bullet other than that.
There was a question in a session earlier that was about whether product management was art or science. So maybe later on we'll dive into that. But that's really interesting. Yes, thank you. How do you tackle that, Kushal? Like, what's your approach in terms of remaining flexible but not too flexible?
Can you hear me? Yeah. So this is day to day, actually, right? Like, you are working towards a particular goal, and then you can easily get sidetracked by certain new features that you have to work on, right? And that could be an urgent client request, a certain problem that you're trying to solve, or it's just a feature that looks more appealing than what you had initially planned for. So my approach is, I'll just type it here. It's VUFB. Basically, we are compelling everyone to ask these questions. What is the value? What does the value does this particular feature bring in? What is the usability like? Does it really help the customer, right? And what's the feasibility of it at this point as we are talking about it? Like, you want to make a bridge without pillars, but do you even have walls so that you can eliminate that? So if you don't even have walls, well, let's not even talk about it because we don't have the means, correct? So it's not feasible. And lastly, but not the least, of course, it's the business impact. The overall goals that you have made, whether at company level or even at the product level, does it really have a positive business impact? And can we accommodate this particular feature? So not officially that, something that I bring it out, but this is something, these four values I keep in mind, and I compel the requesters to provide a reasoning as to why this feature gets suddenly like an urgency over everything else that we have planned. So it helps me strategize accordingly.
Or alternatively, if they can't give a good reason why to prioritize it over everything else, that it shouldn't be, I guess. So that's great. Thank you. Carrie, have you had any similar experiences there?
Yeah, sure. And actually, the example I had in mind maybe hopefully answers the question Peter had just posted. So in staying flexible, something I've seen that really helps is being really honest about why we saw the outcomes we did. And sometimes it's for successful projects and sometimes it's for failed projects. So I'm the beneficiary of that right now. I'm a product lead for payments at Wave. And this is a product we had actually tried multiple times in the past. And the way the company had thought of it is this is a speculative product line. It won't work for a long time, but once it does work, it's going to drive a lot of value for the company. So in previous attempts, it always was time boxed. We'll let a team work on this for a quarter or X number of months, and then we'll check in on results. And only if we're seeing like really positive adoption, will we dedicate a lot more of the company to working on payments. And something that's really critical is the first few times we tried, we saw that adoption wasn't what we were hoping for. And we were really clear on smartphone adoption isn't high enough in our parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And then also our customers aren't comfortable enough with digital money generally. And then the last thing is we don't have enough base users of our other product areas that we can then funnel into payments. So knowing why something failed at first meant that we could reevaluate that on a regular basis. And then the latest go around, we were looking at trends in smartphone adoption and trends in our own user growth. And those had changed enough that we were willing to take another crack at payments. The thing about customer attitudes is a little squishier or harder to know until we tried it. And anyway, this go around, we had enough conviction that the things that had stopped us from succeeding in the past were no longer true. And indeed, we've seen that it's been growing a ton and driving a lot of really positive growth for the company. So making the space to examine why you saw the outcomes in the past and really clearly boiling down complex situations to the most important factors that caused success or failure can equip your company to make better decisions in the future.
Yeah, no, that's some really interesting examples there. That's great. And Chris, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on this in terms of kind of how you know when to revisit things. Maybe as Carrie was saying there, like, could you build on that idea a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think you should build in cadences within your organization that allow you to constantly adjust and evaluate whether your strategy is working, right? Like we should be, if we think about it, again, we kind of have a working set of tenets that we call them that are this over that types of statements where we will focus on this over that. And so people may have seen these mostly in the Agile manifesto, where the most known example is people over process. Now, it doesn't mean that we say we never do process, but it means that usually we choose people over process as an example. And so we have a set of these tenets that we use to help make decisions as like a guidance from the top down. And so in those cases, though, we're looking for those signals that we connect to those tenets to say, are these signals actually are they showing us that these tenets are working in some way? And if not, that means that we should alter our tenets, or we should rotate some in and some out. And so we start to then allow for this ability to adjust our strategy over time. I would say, though, that your strategy should not be planning, which planning is really about future looking, about what am I going to do in 6 months or a year or 5 years or whatever. That's not strategy, right? I wrote a post about this, but strategy is really about like, how are you making decisions today towards the most important thing? And I think a few people on this panel have already said that, but your strategy is about making that decision right now about the most important thing. And that's why I guess I've started to call it a spine of strategy, roadmap and backlog or tasks, is that if any of these things are out of alignment for today, you'll make poor decisions. And so I think that's really, really important. I'd also argue that for earlier stage companies where they don't know as much about their market or about their customer or even about like what are they supposed to do, their strategy is effectively to learn. And so Kent Beck has a really good model called 3X, which is about the S curve, where you have explore, expand, and extract or exploit is what he used to call it. And so when you're in this like explore phase, you actually don't know what's working at that point. And so your strategy is more of it's basically a hypothesis, but that hypothesis is something you should be testing as fast as possible. And so in those cases, the metrics that you're looking at is like number of experiments rather than what are the metrics that we're moving in some way. And so I think that's like a very valuable way to start to look at how is it that we're building as many fast and cheap experiments as possible to be able to test the hypotheses we have, to be able to then get to some type of product market fit, which is where, when you move up that S curve into the expand, it's basically everything starts breaking because you find bottlenecks in your product. And so then it's all about fixing them. And so, I don't know, I think like misunderstanding where you are on that curve causes a lot of people to make poor decisions. Like I've been on teams where we thought we had product market fit, or at least the leadership team believed they had product market fit, when the reality was we were still in explore space. And so we were making decisions that were much more about like, how do we unblock certain things, when we didn't really know whether those were the cases that were meaningful in some way. So that's what I would say about how do we kind of like constantly readjust. And maybe like one other thing I would add about this is that if you don't have the ability to not only review on some cadence your strategy, but also to then look to the future about how this strategy may work out in the future, I think things like scenario planning, role play, wargaming, I think a bunch of these types of techniques from different industries and professions, I think can help us understand really the space of the future. And I think that's really interesting because I've not seen enough people, a lot of the times in these group meetings, it will be where a leader will give a hand down where it's about the strategy and there's no discussion, right? There's no like trying it out, and there's no like kind of workshopping the way that the mental models of the leader differ from the mental models of the people that are on the team, and how we would in certain situations make different decisions. And so I think there's a much more we can do around that, especially when we talk about like the art and science of product management. If you want to tie it back to that, is that the reality is like product management is a lot about tacit knowledge. And so it's about this intuition that we build up over time. That's why like every product leader that has to write a document about what is product management here, I've tried to do that at like 2 or 3 different organizations. Everybody fails at writing that document. And the reason why is because it's really hard to like write down what explicitly you should do in this particular context at this particular time for this particular role. And so that's why we keep on saying it depends. But what it really means is that when you join a team, there's kind of a loose association of like, what are the artifacts a product manager should do? What are the processes that we should own? What are the decisions we should own? And then we need to negotiate with our team to decide like, what are the things that they actually need help with as a product manager? Now, we should not be doing bullshit work, and we should not be doing like moving Jira cards around a board because an engineer doesn't want to do that. That's not what a product manager is for. But like, we should be in some way negotiating what is the way product management can help in this particular team. And that's why this idea of art and science is so blurred, is because there's no set kind of specific task, even for engineering, right? I'd say for engineering leaders, the same thing happens, because they sometimes step into this product management world.
Great. I think we've got time for one more question, and then we'll move over to audience questions. So if you haven't already submitted your question and you want to get it in, stick it in the chat box and we'll come to it on the next go round. The last question that I had really was something that I think most people can relate to, which is kind of making sure that the customer or the user, depending on what your product is, that they're at the heart of the product strategy. We all can come up with clever strategies and say, this is what we're going to do, and have a grand plan. But if we haven't actually taken the time to make sure that it's linked to the customer or the user, then what's the point, I guess? So how do you tackle that idea? How do you go about making sure that we're focusing on the customer and putting the user at the heart of that product strategy? Maybe we'll come to Kerry first on this one.
Okay, yay. I have the most basic answer, and then I'll be listening for if the other panelists have more brilliant things to say. My honest answer is you have to talk to the users and ideally bring them into your company. Something I love doing is making sure that of our customers, the team gets exposure to them directly in the form of a conversation or user interview. And I've gotten pushback on this because it seems like maybe a bad use of precious engineering time or precious designer time. But I've found that there are a million questions that crop up in the course of building even a simple feature, and giving more direct customer exposure to our team means that the team can make better decisions on the fly and increase the odds that we're actually building the right thing for our customers. So I think of that as going slow at the start and investing in this kind of really deep customer empathy in order to go fast and speed along the rest of the process more smoothly. So not rocket science, but it really does make a big difference.
I think that's maybe part of the big challenge, right? That everybody wants to do this, but you get that pushback, and how do you overcome it? So, Kerry, I don't know if you have any thoughts on how you overcame it, or if any of the other panelists want to jump in.
Yeah, I agree with Carrie. When you want to build wealth, the simple answer is you save more and try to kind of earn more, right? I think it's as simple as that, and there's no shortcut to not talking to customers. There's basically that's is as simple as that. I just went to a conference last week, and this was the first in-person conference after like 3 years. I can't remember since the pandemic, and I cannot describe the effect of meeting real people in 3D and having this real conversation. And it was such a surreal moment for me. I walked out with the keynote session really inspired and really kind of feeling aligned with the mission. And I then spoke with customers, and I realized, like, yes, there's a North Star, but there is the reality of all the struggles they go through. And that just made me this mission alignment moment for me. Is like just so important that you speak with them. So that's the part, right? Like just making sure it is baked into your into your schedule. And there are programs that your company offers. Obviously, you want to leverage those. There are these automated channels where you get feedback. You want to make sure you read those. Make sure if you have like a subscription for this feedback, everyone is included, not just you, but design, engineering, research, whoever is involved. Make sure that everyone is reading through those and build a culture. You discuss those pain points during your meetings, uh, quote those. I think that the key is to really infuse a culture of customer or user empathy. I think that's how you infuse that. It depends on your org, it depends, but I would say the culture of customer empathy. And there are just so many ways you could do that. You could have personas and then paint it on the wall or your virtual wall, depending on how distributed your team is. And leverage every opportunity. Like you often have customers come back to you with an issue, and it's so tempting to fix that issue and say, okay, we're done. How about reaching back to them? Hey, now that we have fixed this issue, I would like to invite you, for a broader discussion. I found those discussions to be more meaningful than a panel where you invite these customers, high profile customers. Often I would rather talk with someone who is really like feeling the pain right now. And once you kind of stop the bleeding, if you could understand the holistic picture, you learn so much. There was a time in my job where I just said, hey, it seems like you're local, why don't I come to your office? And Carrie mentioned bringing users to your office. It's really amazing. And equally amazing is going to their location and really trying to understand. We often feel like, oh, this company is big, they make millions of dollars in revenue. But when you go visit your actual customer, you realize they are really understaffed, and this is just one of the 100 things that she is tackling. And that created so much empathy for me. So when I walked back, I summarized the details. By the way, always summarize your notes and share it with the team, and make it as much actionable and easily discoverable as possible, because you are the voice for customer. You should have engineers, designers in these calls, but you will be doing more of this. So make sure there is a really good framework of these conversations are documented, shared, and they're always available. So yeah, building a culture of empathy, I think, is our chief role.
I really like that's the way to see it, empathy, and really getting to grips with those pain points, and then you can empathize with what they actually want. We've got about 10 minutes or 12 minutes or so left. So any questions, pop them in the box, and we do have some to whistle through. So maybe Chris or Kushal, do you want to add anything on this one?
Yeah, just real quick. I particular there was a particular application that I was working on, which was primarily used by the executives in our firm. EY being a big company, there are many executives, and it could also be used by the executive assistants, right? So, what happens is in product management, when we talk about our clients or customers, we have select group of representatives who we work with, and we tend to get feedback from. But what happens is, though that select group of customers, they might only represent certain personas. So it's important that we get feedback from all the personas. Chances are that the other personas who are using the application, they represent a bigger volume than the ones you are talking to on day-to-day basis. So the executive assistant example I was talking to you about, it had a huge impact on our application because most partners, they don't use the application. They want the executive assistants to do their work instead. Now, if they don't know how to use the application properly, if they find it cumbersome or if they get lost in the way, if um, it's just way too many clicks, then it's affecting the overall channel for the executives. So I started interviewing the executive assistants too and immediately made them the subject matter experts. So now, considering the magnitude of the company that we have, there are way too many executive assistants. So we got wealth of information from them. It became a very key source of feedback that we received from them. And on similar topic, I'm currently working on PFM, which is product feedback management. I'm working on a white paper on that, and I would love feedback from fellow panelists and other product managers as I'm preparing that. But that is what it represents. Like I'm planning, it's more of a weekly or bi-weekly workshop, which is more of a cage match, where representatives from different segments of the customers, they get together and they bring up the observations or the issues that they are facing, and basically in that particular time frame we try to decide what's the importance of it, what's the priority of it. We don't decide which release it's going to get into and stuff like that, but at least we are listening and prioritizing. It's right then and there, they tend to weigh against each other. And empathy, like you mentioned, Yogesh, it's extremely important, and that's what we try to bring to the table from product management standpoint, that one persona needs to understand the other persona's issues that they are facing, because that might be a bigger representation of the usage overall.
Great, perfect. So we've got about 9 minutes left for questions, so I think maybe we'll just jump straight into those, and we'll start off with you, Chris, and if you've got anything to add on that, you can always do it in this part, but we're going to jump straight into the questions, I think. So the first one was from Karen, so thank you, Karen. The question here is, what do you see as the key difference between a product manager in a digital professional services organization versus a software organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably just mostly terminology, and then probably structure by which the product management team links into the rest of the organization. Because I think there's, like I was saying, the idea of like product management being under IT, there is a clear difference in the way that management will think about, and when I say management, I mean leadership within an organization, that if it's an IT organization, it's more of a cost center. And how is this like reducing the number of things we can do, because they never want to build what we want to build, to the idea of like, oh, well, so product management is actually helping us figure out the right thing to build in some way so that we don't waste resources, so that we build the most effective thing that's possible. So I think that's like the key difference. I mean, I also want to outline maybe this dichotomy that I see a lot of the time between product management and project management. And so I've talked about this a lot as kind of on the spectrum of kind of risk reduction, where I would say the project manager role actually plays. And these could be called technical product managers, PMO, program managers, whatever you want to call them, versus this idea of like the product manager existing to help develop innovation. And so that's where I think we talk about like how strategy fits into this model. It's not one or the other, right? What you actually want is you want strategy to be something that is, moving us towards the end goal that we're trying to get to through decisions today. But we want to then also have some risk, like we don't want to make the same mistakes over and over again. We want to reduce the known risks that we have in the world. But we don't want to do it so much that we never actually end up building something that is differentiated or better than what is available today. And so I think that kind of that balance, I think, is really, really important. Inside of these organizations, though, that balance is not there. Right. So in a lot of these organizations where we have like an IT group, tends to be very risk adverse. And so that means that product managers can't actually do the job that they should be doing from a strategic kind of vision standpoint. And so I don't know, that's how I'd say that, speak to that point.
Great. Yogesh, did you want to come in on that one briefly?
Is there a specific question you want to take, or the same question that Chris responded?
Yeah, I just saw you came off mute, so I wondered if you had anything to add on the difference between PM in a professional services org versus a software org, but we can move on to a different one if not.
No, I think everything Chris said, I don't think it should change. Maybe you have more responsibility if you're not in a software org, because you have to build that culture. And you have a little bit more kind of uphill battle, but I don't think the tenets of product management should change.
Great. So I think broad agreement there that it's not too different. It's just a different context, but similar skills, similar approach, really. Great. So let's move to the next question then. So the next one comes from Zoheb. Thank you, Zoheb. So I often see myself and teams around ask my teams around to make conservative guesstimates for metric forecasts, either with or without existing benchmarks available. Any advice on how to define outcomes or KPIs? Does anyone want to take that one?
Like, I think I would say, like, in some cases don't, right? And the reason why I say that is that part of the product management job is not just this idea of like taking perfect information and then turning that into an action plan. It's about what's referred to as actually like abductive thinking, which is that we have a bunch of evidence that could be qualitative, it could be quantitative. And then through the fact that we're trying to be the embodiment of the customer, we then make an imaginative leap towards something that we think is valuable to do. And so I think like the worst thing we can do when it comes to innovation inside of teams is requiring a business case around ROI rather than building evidence by learning through execution. And so I think that to me is, why I guess I bristle at a lot of these kind of data-centric approaches to product management, is that I think it ends up creating this bar that I don't think a lot of product managers can actually cross when it comes to experimentation. And so I don't know, that's what I would say. It's like, I think there's real value to understanding like what is progress towards an objective, but I don't think it's as simple as like, like one of the things I really hate is actually effort versus impact types of prioritization. And the reason why is it removes all of this connection between like what are the values or strategy we're trying to achieve, and how do we know that we're going to achieve that through the things that we can measure, or maybe we can't measure right now, but we want to measure. That is way more important to me, to actually have that type of linkage between strategy and prioritization, rather than using something like even the idea of like Rice scoring removes a lot of like what is actually we're trying to do as far as trade-offs, and just tries to back into something that is kind of pseudo data, but it's really just people's opinions. And then once you start having these things, people then start gaming them to just do what they want to do in the first place. And so I don't know, I've been on like this task to like try to reduce down the amount of things that we end up doing when it comes to prioritization methodologies, because it honestly, the team needs to build some intuition. Leadership needs to give them guidance about what are the guardrails that they should and should not be doing. But beyond that, it's all about experimentation and about intuition and about kind of building out things and then testing to see if they've actually, like, our hypothesis was correct or not. So that's what I'd say.
And if I can jump in quickly, just in case you don't have Chris at your company to eloquently argue for this, I think to articulate the gap we're talking about here is it's quite bad to rely on metrics as kind of the sprint where it's like you either hit these numbers or you don't. That's also kind of the 6 month, like very short time window for performance reviews. Like all of that can lead to really bad, like short-term product management instead of like long-term delivering values and outcome. I do think metrics can be quite helpful, again, to have that high level conceptual model with your team and your company leadership in order to have those guardrails of, hey, broadly, how does our ecosystem work? Where are people getting value? If we change like X core parts of the ecosystem, what do we then expect that to do? And I think that can help your team in getting resources and kind of negotiating what success looks like at shorter time horizons. So I think there is a place for it. I think it's dangerous though when it's like you are focused on one specific number and it becomes a binary, like yes or no. Did we hit it for whether you're successful?
And that's why we have the MVP approach, right? Like sometimes you have to take the leap. Granted, you don't have the benchmarks right from the get-go, but it's important to try out your product, even if it is a strawman model, at least you're getting the car out and you're going to figure out that how many signals are up ahead, rather than just sitting on the driveway and figuring out that I wonder it's going to be so many traffic lights that I have to go through. So sometimes it's important to just take the leap. MVP approach is like, as all the product managers know why that's important. It's our first step into knowing, testing the waters essentially, and see like, how much, what could be done, how much could be done. Uh, are we even serving the purpose? So it's important to just start at some point.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have. I can see, Carrie, you've kindly gone back to Paula in the chat there. So, Paula, we did get an answer to you just via text rather than audio. Hope that's okay. But all that remains for me to do really is just to thank our wonderful panelists. I've really enjoyed that session. I think it was really, really interesting. And you each had some very useful insights to share. So I'm sure the audience will have taken a lot from that. So thank you all.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
all.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
We're going to move on to our next session. So we'll see you in about 15 minutes time. And I'll look forward to seeing you there. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.